Hello, and welcome to my next video. Today I would like to talk about podcasts, and not just any kind of podcasts, but about art podcasts. So I listen to many different types of podcasts. They don't have to be art. My favorite are, for example, the Mustards, and they are just lifestyle kind of bloggers from Sweden, based in Berlin. Really interesting, so I recommend it. I will link it down below. But because, of course, my interests, professional and otherwise, I love listening to art podcasts, and actually I have been struggling to find a good one. So I've listed 5 that I think are interesting, but if you know any good art podcasts, please let me know and maybe comment down below so I can check it out. I'm vlogging today from my refurbished home office, so the backdrop is a bit different. So let's start with the list. The first one I would like to talk about is the Art Newspaper podcast. The Art Newspaper is just a monthly kind of magazine, also online magazine. The magazine itself covers breaking news in the art world and gives some sort of an overview of the most exciting and the most current events in the art world. And also the podcast is quite similar. It also covers those breaking stories, interesting exhibitions. They also cover the most important art events abroad, so like Venice Biennial, Berlin Gallery Weekend. In this episode from October, they go to a new museum in New York to talk about the newest exhibition there. So yeah, there is quite a lot of material there from all over the world. If you are interested in kind of major artists, major players in the art world, then you can find out a lot about that from the Art Newspaper. I think it is slightly commercialized, the podcast. I think the podcast is very much kind of driven by the established. The podcast itself is very sleek and elegant, sort of. It has got this radio feel to it, and it's done by people who know about art a lot, by professionals and people that are kind of in this exclusive art establishment. So if you want to find out more about that, definitely go and listen to that. It will give you a good idea of who is really ruling the art world at the moment. So next is Art Monthly Talk Show, and Art Monthly Talk Show is again sort of a radio podcast edition of the magazine, so it's much more intellectual than the Art Newspaper. The same with the magazine. The magazine itself is well known for its critical content. Sorry, that's my printer. So the idea behind that podcast is to invite the contributors to the recent edition of the printed magazine, and then they cover the text that they wrote for that issue. So it's actually quite an interesting summary of what you can read in the magazine. So if you don't have time to read the full magazine, then you can just listen to the podcast and you still know what are the main stories in the printed version of the magazine. It's based in London, so naturally it focuses a lot on British art, as well as the Art Newspaper. They cover the most important art events globally as well. So I would say the biggest difference is that Art Monthly is much more critical and intellectual in a way than the Art Newspaper. So next is an American podcast run by Artsy. This podcast, well, it's different for the reason that it's actually based in America and in New York. If you're interested in that part of the world, or you just want to find out more about what happens in America in the arts, then tune in into Artsy podcast, because they focus more on American exhibitions, but it has got this a very relaxed sort of way of delivery, so you can feel a bit of a difference between British and American way of podcasting. They also invite different guests that talk about certain issues and the most important exhibitions that are on at the moment, but also they like to cover certain topics that are current in the art world. So for example, there was an episode talking about, for example, whether you can make it in the art world if you are not a rich kid. And also there was another one about Instagram and the influence of Instagram on art. Quite interesting that each episode usually tends to finish with the guests talking about where are they planning to go next in terms of where they're going to, which shows are they going to visit. So it may be, well, it's a nice kind of advice if you are in New York, then probably you would use that advice and go and see that show. The last two podcasts I would like to talk about are a bit different because they are more like grassroots DIY type of a podcast. So the art newspaper, Art Monthly and Artsy, they all run by an institution, by an art magazine. Artsy, for example, is an online platform for buying and discovering art. So they are all institutions, but the last two are not institutional and more like run by artists and art enthusiasts. So number 4 is the White Pube podcast, and I was talking about the White Pube in my vlog about art magazines. So the White Pube are two women, two art critics that hate criticism, who criticize the current art establishment, and I think this podcast is a bit of a platform for them to rant about the art world and what is their view on current kind of state of affairs. Their podcast is as informal as their writing. They write in this very recognizable manner with loads of spelling mistakes, loads of emojis and abbreviations that maybe not everyone understands. And the way they do the podcast, they just take the microphone with them for a lunch or maybe for a walk. They just switch the record button on and talk to each other, so you feel a bit like you just joined them at a lunch, and you can listen what they are like discussing. And I think just to give you an example of what they've been discussing, what they discussed in the past podcast was, for example, white ignorance, and they are very much concerned about that dominance of white people in the art world and culture in general. For example, another one was about perspectives of female artists, but at the moment it looks like they are neglecting the podcasts a bit and more focusing on writing, so I don't know if they will post anything anytime soon, but you can still access the past podcasts. I think there are 5 episodes there, definitely worth listening. It's if you are into kind of informal conversations and art ranting, that this podcast is definitely for you. And the last but not the least is another American podcast and another grassroots sort of DIY podcast, but also it's the oldest podcast that I found, the oldest art podcast that I found. So it's called Bad Art Spots. It's been running since 2005, so 13 years, and it's reaching back the times when actually no one even really heard about podcasts. It was still more time over radio. They are a group of art enthusiasts, artists who one evening decided to do a podcast over a beer in a pub, and since then they've been releasing a podcast every week, and at least I think that's the plan. And so far there are 656 episodes on their website. This podcast is based in Chicago, and they cover stories related to the Chicago art scene, but also to some of the established artists as well. So I think it's a mixture of the established, what's current in the art world, and what's very relevant for Chicago. So So in a way, it would be fantastic if all of the cities had their own art podcasts, and they would cover current kind of topics here in each city. So that's my list of 5 best art podcasts, but if you can recommend me any other, I would really appreciate that. And also please subscribe to my channel down below. These days everyone has to have a podcast, and I've got my own podcast as well. So basically some of the interviews that I do with artists and curators on YouTube, I'm also kind of transferring to iTunes and SoundCloud, so you can listen to those just by listening. You don't have to watch a YouTube video. And I think my next video will be an interview with Karolina Korupczyńska. It will be in a form of a podcast, kind of film podcast, and we will be talking about artists and curators and how to work together. Thank you so much for watching, and bye bye.